Hello to everyone joining us across the globe, and thank you all so much for joining us. But above all, thank you for your dedication to the profoundly important mission that gathers us all together today. I'm Aria McKenna, a founding member of the Healthy Planet Action Coalition, an organization whose mission is to ensure that the world adopts a comprehensive global climate strategy capable of restoring a safe climate for our children and grandchildren before we cross the point of no return. It's an honor to welcome you to this critically important conversation about the global heating emergency. What's the plan? Now, 10 years ago, the Paris Climate Accord committed to the 195 signatories to take all necessary action to keep the Earth's temperature below 1.5 degrees Celsius, with 2 degrees Celsius as a threshold that we must not cross. But the world has begun to warm exponentially since then, with many scientists projecting we may now exceed 2 degrees by 2040 and blow past 3 degrees Celsius in the 2050s. The truth is that the world has already warmed to the dangerous level of 1.5 degrees Celsius, which has already begun to trigger ecological tipping points around the planet. We must reverse this trend as soon as humanly possible. The Healthy Planet Action Coalition believes that ultimately we must reduce warming to well below 1 degree Celsius to restore a safe climate. Now, because of tipping points and the rapid escalation of natural disasters around the world, we must develop a new strategy that's capable of reducing temperatures while also helping to restore Earth's natural capacity to draw down greenhouse gases, so that ultimately we can achieve a new goal of net negative emissions. We need a holistic strategy for creating a safe climate, one that addresses all the causes of global warming. The Healthy Planet Action Coalition calls this the climate triad. In this event today, we will hear from some of the world's foremost experts on climate who are dedicating their lives to the fight for a livable planet. Together, we will explore what's at stake, what's possible, and ways that we can all work together to prevent global warming from crossing the 2 degrees Celsius threshold. Now, to start, please put your virtual hands together for Dr. Dennis Garrity to give us a brief overview of the event program. Dennis is a distinguished research fellow and former Director General of the World Agroforestry Center and current chair of the Healthy Planet Action Coalition. Take it away, Dennis.
Thank you, Aria, and hello, everyone. You are probably here today because you're on a journey, like me, a journey to understand what's happening with our climate and learn how bad things are going to get and determine what humanity has got to do about it, and fast. 2 degrees is now expected by 2040, and 3 degrees is looming before 2060. We will begin our event today by delving into just how much temperatures are now accelerating, decades earlier than expected, and why this is happening. And that will be with 2 brief 10-minute presentations. Then we will have 2 more 10-minute presentations on what the impacts are going to be on vulnerable people and ecosystems as we reach tipping points during the coming decades, and as temperatures approach and exceed 2 degrees C within the next 15 years. Next, we will be assessing how much emissions reduction and CO2 removals are capable of stopping temperature from rising above 2 degrees. And we have 4 brief presentations on that topic. Here we have 3 pathways available: reduce, remove, and reflect. and we'll examine the potential of each of these to stop the temperature acceleration. Finally, we'll focus on how we can mobilize and create and implement a new climate plan that integrates all of the most promising tools at our disposal. We'll focus on the coalitions needed to do this. Coalitions of climate vulnerable countries and coalitions of activated citizens. And on the key next steps needed to realize this new, more comprehensive approach. So that's the journey. And our guides will be renowned experts in each of these areas. So let's pick up our walking sticks and get started. Aria, please launch us on the road and introducing our first speaker.
Thank you, Dennis. Now, to manage our time and the many speakers we have, we've asked our guests to pre-record their videos. And as the videos are playing, everyone is encouraged to react and interact in the chat box. To ask questions directed at the speakers, please use the Q&A button so it's easy for them to spot your queries. And at the end of each session, the speakers will respond to questions that arise from the Q&A. Okay, so session 1, the accelerated global heating emergency. To open our discussions, we will learn about the science of non-linear, rapidly accelerating global heating. Our first speaker, Dr. Leon Simons, the executive director of the Club of Rome in the Netherlands, is a climate and energy researcher, communicator, and host of the Climate Chat Science Education channel on YouTube. He's known for translating complex climate science into actionable insights. Here's Leon Simons.
Hello, my name is Leon Simons, and today I will be talking about the accelerated warming that we are witnessing globally, and especially recently. And of course, when we're talking about warming, what's important to note is that the world has agreed to holding the increase in the global average temperature to well below 2 degrees Celsius, above pre-industrial levels, pursuing efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. And as they mentioned during the Paris Agreement, recognize that this would significantly reduce the risks and impacts of climate change. And of course, that's crucial to know because these temperature limits are agreed upon because it's estimated that this will reduce risk. And we are now finding out that we are already experiencing a lot of climate risks with lower levels of warming. And then what's important also to realize is what drives global warming. And the main drivers of global warming are, of course, greenhouse gases, the anthropogenic greenhouse gases, human-caused greenhouse gases, cause already over 1.5 degrees of global warming. But with the burning of fossil fuels, there's also a lot of sulfur being emitted. And this sulfur has a cooling impact because it reflects sunlight and it makes clouds whiter and larger, which also reflect more sunlight. And these sulfur emissions are estimated to have cooled the planet or reduced global warming by about 0.5 degree globally, and by as much as 1.5 degree over the northern hemisphere, because of course about 90% of the global population of now 8.2 billion people live over the northern hemisphere, and that's where they grow food, that's where they burn fossil fuels, and that's where the regional cooling was mainly realized unintentionally, of course, by this unintentional cooling impact of air pollution. And as we published back in 2023, we now see a disentanglement, so to say, of CO2 emissions from fossil fuel burning. and of sulfur dioxide. And this sulfur, this caused a reduction in the cooling of the sulfur. And also here it's important to note that this cooling of the sulfur is nonlinear. So the more you reduce this air pollution, the more the unmasking of the cooling impact will be. And already back in 2021, Norman Loeb and his colleagues from NASA and from NOAA showed that the rate at which the Earth is retaining heat, which is called the Earth energy imbalance, had doubled. So the planet was accumulating twice as much energy, or energy twice as fast as before, and that occurred between 2001 and 2019. And in 2022, James Hansen and his colleagues, including me, first published this paper as a preprint. It's called Global Warming in the Pipeline, where we warned about accelerated warming, and that the rate of global warming, so surface warming, would double or increase by about 50% to 100%. And that was based on evidence from the past climate, from paleoclimate, from these NASA satellite data, from ocean heat content, and from our understanding of the main drivers of global warming. And those are the greenhouse gas and the sulfur aerosols, which I mentioned. And now, back in 2022, there was quite a lot of skepticism about this, but with 2 years of additional data, of course, 2023 and 2024 were very warm, and now we see this accelerated warming materialize. And that's now already quite accepted science. The consensus, there's now the scientific consensus acknowledges that the Earth's energy imbalance now has more than doubled. So a few more years of data, and now all these, you see many authors here. So these are really many of the world-leading climate scientists acknowledge that the Earth's energy imbalance has more than doubled, and that global warming has accelerated significantly. And again, led by James Hansen, that there is a global warming acceleration, and that the public and the United Nations are not well informed about this. And that brings me to this table, where we can see, this is from Grant Foster and Stephen Ramsell. There's a preprint, but that's based on a methodology they published already in 2011, where they correct the global temperatures and the warming rate for El Nino and for volcanic aerosols and for solar variability. And then if we extrapolate the table 1, and then we look at the warming rate, we are now around this time, for all intents and purposes, with all these different data sets, we are now crossing the 1.5 degrees Celsius global warming threshold. And we could already, within decades, around or even before 2040, reach 2 degrees Celsius of global warming, if this rate of warming continues. So as the paper mentions, the most important insight from these adjusted data is that there is no longer any doubt regarding a recent increase in the warming rate. Although the world may not continue warming at such a fast rate of about 0.43 degrees Celsius per decade, it could likewise continue accelerating to even faster rates. And this is a warning call by the German Meteorological and Physical Society from September 2025, last month, where they warned that we could even see 3 degrees of global warming by 2050. And that might seem extreme and unlikely, but all it would take is for the nonlinear warming rate to continue, and then we could reach this threshold of 3 degrees even by 2050 already. And that brings me also here to back to this NASA satellite data, where you see that if you look at the climate models from the IPCC, the 3 degrees by 2050 will be really extreme and unlikely. But if you look at the satellite data, it's outside the range of all these models. And that's, whatever way you look at it, it's outside even outside the uncertainty range of these models. And then to conclude, I want to show you the greenhouse gas forcing. So the forcing is what forces the climate to change from the past 130,000 years. And then you see that even during the Eemian, when global sea levels were 6 to 9 meters higher than they are today, the greenhouse gas forcing was almost as high as it was in the pre-industrial times. And now it's really off the charts. Within 250 years, if you include other greenhouse gas next to CO2, and this is based on IPCC methodology, the greenhouse gas forcing has already more than doubled relative to the CO2 concentration of 1750, and that's really worrying, and that's one of the main reasons why we will see a lot of fast warming in the decades ahead, and which is why we need to limit this warming and adapt rapidly to these changes. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was a sobering message from Dr. Simons on how rapidly global heating is now accelerating. It's important for us to understand the potential repercussions of that message to help spark effective global action. Now, let's welcome our next speaker, Dr. James Hansen. Dr. Hansen is a senior climatologist at the Earth Institute and Columbia University. He's one of the most influential climate scientists of our time. As former director of NASA's Goddard Institute for Space Studies, his early testimony before the United States Congress helped create the basis for the world's understanding of global warming. Dr. Hansen continues to advocate boldly for science-based action and intergenerational justice.
The following video was presented by Jim Hansen last February 2025 during the conference entitled Global Warming Has Accelerated, an intimate conversation with leading climate scientists.
Global warming has accelerated. Between 1970 and 2010, temperature increased almost linearly 0.18 degrees Celsius per decade. Since then, the warming rate is twice as fast, 0.36 degrees per decade. In the last 2 years, temperature leaped more than 0.4 degrees, spurred by an El Nino. But the El Nino was weak and could only cause half of that warming. The warming was too great to be entirely a natural fluctuation. A climate forcing must contribute. In the next chart, the portion that is not natural must be due to one of the two significant human-made forcings, greenhouse gases or aerosols. Greenhouse gases are well measured and their forcing is known accurately. The other forcing, aerosols, tiny particles in the air, which serve as cloud formation nuclei, are a negative forcing and cause cooling. because they cause increased clouds, brighter clouds that reflect sunlight. But aerosol forcing is not measured. The blue line is IPCC's estimate, which we will find to be an underestimate. The next chart notes that humanity made a bad deal, a Faustian bargain, when we used aerosols to offset almost half of greenhouse gas warming. Particulate air pollution kills 6 to 8 million people per year. We can't let that continue. So our Faustian payment to the devil has come due. And the next chart shows the International Maritime Organization since 2010 has ratcheted down the limit on sulfur in ship fuels, providing an opportunity to study aerosol forcing. Emissions were limited first in emission control areas, ECA, near the coast. But the most important change was in January of 2020, when a strict limit was imposed on the global mean. And the next chart, with fewer aerosols and clouds, Earth should become darker. In fact, it has. Earth's albedo, or reflectivity, decreasing 0.5%. Part of this darkening is aerosol forcing, but much of it must be climate feedbacks. The surface becomes darker as snow and ice melt, and clouds decrease on a hotter planet. So, shown on the next chart, we can separate these factors based on their spatial and temporal distributions, as Pushkar will discuss. Ship aerosol forcing is largest in the North Pacific and North Atlantic, where it dominates over natural aerosols. And on the next chart, I show that the largest increase of absorbed sunlight as a function of time on the horizontal axis and latitude on the vertical axis. It does occur, especially beginning in 2020, at latitudes where ship aerosols dominate. And as shown on the next chart, sea surface temperature, which is a great diagnostic, an indication of heat content in the ocean's upper mixed layer. It integrates energy imbalance over time. And at latitudes 30 to 55 north, SST went up rapidly after 2020. This is an equal area projection. So in the last 2 years, high latitudes contributed as much to global warming as the tropical El Nino. You can see that between 2020 and 2023, the tropical cooling was increasing and offsetting high latitude warming. But beginning in late 2023, they worked together and each provided half of the global anomaly. The next chart shows an alternative analysis in which we subtract the global temperature trend caused by the average climate forcing and subtract global temperature variability due to the El Nino cycle based on its known relation to the Nino index, which leaves us the green curve, which is global temperature change due to all other forcings. For example, global cooling from the Pinatubo volcanic eruption in 1991. Since 2020, a unique anomaly has grown to 0.3 of a degree, which must be mainly the ship aerosol forcing. So the summary on the next chart, we infer a ship aerosol forcing in our analysis from of about 5 watts, 0.5 watts, and ice snow feedback of 0.15 watts. The rest must be cloud feedback, which is a huge cloud feedback in just 20 years. That implies high climate sensitivity. For double CO2, the CO2 forcing, water vapor feedback, and surface albedo feedback already yield almost 3 degrees. So this large cloud feedback means that climate sensitivity is substantially higher than 3 degrees. So we must understand this situation better. Models used by IPCC are not realistic. IPCC defined a scenario, RC 2.6, which gives a 50% chance to keep warming under 2 degrees. But it is an implausible scenario that assumes power plants will burn biofuels, capture the CO2, and bury it. That scenario is now impossible. 2 degree target is dead. The next chart shows why. Because the global energy use is rising, and it will continue to rise. And most energy still comes from fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are amazing. 1 gallon of gasoline contains the work equivalent of 400 hours of a healthy adult. It's convenient, portable, and has raised living standards in much of the world. The next chart, the rest of the world wants to raise their living standards, and they have the right to do so, and they will. So the next chart, the current United Nations policy approach is hopium, hope that actual emissions can be net zero in 25 years. I already showed that that is nonsense. We have retained a policy approach that makes it now impossible unless some miracle occurs that we don't understand. The world only reduced carbon intensity from 0.8 to 0.7 in 50 years. The only country reducing carbon intensity fast enough is Sweden. They built 10 nuclear power plants, and they have carbon-free electricity, and they heat their homes with electricity. And now we know how to build nuclear to produce high temperatures needed for industrial process. But that's a technical detail. The basic problem is that the waste products of fossil fuels are still dumped in the air free of charge.
Thank you, Dr. Hansen. The world failed to respond quickly enough the first time that he warned us, and now is our chance to learn from the past and act on the most recent science. We cannot afford to underestimate the significance of the current trajectory that we're on. We must fold these insights into a new strategy with the teeth to address our emergency situation. I want to remind everyone to share insights in the chat box and to use the Q&A button for questions for the speakers, who will be answering questions there. This will also allow us to include these questions in the panel discussion at the end of the session. Now we're going to be moving into session 2, what happens if we fail to avert 2 degrees Celsius. Now, our next session dives deep into some very sobering realities, but it's crucial that we understand what's at stake so that we can strengthen our resolve to address these challenges, so we can find our way to do what it takes to create a safe climate while we still have the chance. To begin, we're going to hear from Dr. Tim Lenton, Professor of Climate Change and Earth System Science at the University of Exeter. Many of you may be familiar with Dr. Lenton, as he is world-renowned for his pioneering work on climate tipping points and positive pathways that can massively accelerate emissions reductions. Welcome, Tim.
Okay, good to be here. I've got, I'll share my slides. I'll try and keep it to 10 minutes. And I've been asked to talk about the risks of triggering feedbacks and in particular tipping points. And I'm speaking to you in the week in which we just launched our second Global Tipping Points report, the 2025 edition. So if you want to read more about this critical subject of climate and Earth system tipping point risks, you can see the website there, or you can scan the QR code, and I'll put this slide back up at the end. Let me just start a stopwatch to make sure I don't run over. Okay, so let's talk about what a tipping point is. Here I've got a simple system with 2 alternative stable states, and it's in the one on the left, the ball rolling around in the valley, but I'm making that state of the system less stable or less resilient over time. This could be global warming that's forcing some part of the climate system towards a tipping point. So as it's losing stability or resilience, damping feedbacks are getting weaker and amplifying feedbacks within the system are getting stronger. And then there at the tipping point, that amplification within the system is strong enough to support a self-propelling change that's very hard to reverse as the ball rolls down out of the valley that's disappeared into the other valley. So that doesn't happen in all systems, but it can happen in some complex systems under particular conditions. And you saw the qualities of tipping point change. It's abrupt in this case, and it's hard to reverse, and you could stop forcing the system, but it would carry on under its own feedback momentum. The actual timescale of transition is going to depend on the timescale of the system. So some systems like ice sheets are very, very slow. So the rolling of the ball down the hill would still seem slow to us, but be hard to reverse. Now, in the new Global Tipping Points report, we highlight that we're in a new climate reality for 2 reasons. One, we're now saying that we've passed the first major tipping point in the Earth system, and that's for widespread die-off or dieback of coral reefs. And we can say that because we already assessed that the tipping point for coral reefs in terms of global temperature was best guess around 1.2 degrees centigrade of global warming, or if upper range 1.5 degrees centigrade. And in the last 2 years, we've seen the Earth at 1.5 degrees C of warming. We've seen extreme marine heat waves, and we've seen more than 80% of coral reefs experiencing extreme bleaching and dieback. We also know now that we're going to transgress 1.5 degrees C of warming by probably around 2030. So that's a sad reality now. Not everything's lost for the corals. We can talk about that in the question time and how we might protect a fraction of them. But a major ecosystem that supports an estimated $2 trillion per year of ecosystem services is now in some kind of large scale and irreversible decline. Now, they're just one system, the coral reefs, that I'd flagged up out for some years as being potentially prone to a tipping point that would lead to widespread impacts and damages. Here are a few of the other systems that we highlight and some of the evidence that they're changing in an accelerating rate in a bad direction, like the loss of ice accelerating from the Greenland and West Antarctic ice sheets, or the extraordinary droughts and fires that are reflecting the Amazon rainforest, or something I'll focus on more in a minute, the slowdown of the Atlantic overturning circulation. I also indicate some arrows here because these indicate we have the empirical evidence that tipping points interact, and they interact in a way that starting to tip one thing can bring forward tipping another. At least the interactions are of that direction more often than not. There are some cases where tipping one thing would inhibit tipping another, but unfortunately it's more like the proverbial dominoes most of the time. And in fact, the fact that the Arctic is warming up 4 times as fast as the global average, thanks to losing a highly reflective white sea ice surface and replacing it with a dark ocean surface, and the corresponding fact that the warmer atmosphere is holding more moisture and there's more snow and rainfall in the net in the Arctic, and that the amplified warming is melting the Greenland ice sheet, all of those factors pouring extra fresh water into the North Atlantic are why the Atlantic Ocean overturning circulation is slowing down. And we know from Earth history that has profound impacts, including if it slows down or collapses, it will leave heat behind in the Southern Ocean, threatening the ice sheets down there. Now, I've been looking at this tipping point risk for a quarter of a century now, and this is a summary of how the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change assessments have adjusted their risk assessment, or strictly speaking, their likelihood assessment of tipping points over time. And it's a pretty straightforward but alarming story. We used to think it would take 4 or 5 degrees centigrade of global warming for it to become as likely as not that you cross these major tipping points. Now we say we're in the danger zone at 1 to 2 degrees of warming, and really in the danger zone if we go over 2 degrees C. We can look at that in a tiny bit more detail from the latest tipping points report, where we highlight some of the key systems we should be concerned about, talked about the corals and mentioned the West Antarctic and Greenland ice sheets. I want to focus in for the rest of my few minutes just on the risks of tipping changes in the Atlantic Ocean circulation. That's a mixture of 2 related systems, one area of deep convection or deep water formation in the subpolar gyre, and then that's part of this larger Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, or AMOC for short. We're not saying that they will be tipped at 2 degrees. You can see that, though, that it'd be about, we'd assess it about as likely as not for the subpolar gyre deep water formation, and there's certainly a significant risk of tipping the AMOC as it's known. And that these risks are real already at the current level of warming. In fact, if you asked me to put an estimate on it, I'd probably say we're in the range of a 1 to 10% probability that we've already tipped the AMOC. So what is the overturning circulation of the Atlantic, and what are these systems? We're interested in this red surface current here heading northwards, and then sinking formation of deep water either side of Greenland. The left-hand one is the subpolar gyre formation of deep water in the subpolar gyre, it's called. The other region, the Greenland ice and Norwegian seas. This deep water formation propels this blue current, which is going southwards thousands of meters down in the ocean and forming some kind of loop of circulation. Key thing is this is transporting a huge amount of heat from the southern hemisphere to the northern hemisphere, particularly on up to northwest Europe. If you lose or collapse the formation of deep water, first in the subpolar gyre and then in these other seas, it's going to have profound impacts, as we'll see in a minute, on not just on the climate of Europe, but globally. And we already see that in several of our climate models, this can happen. And we know from Earth history that there have been tipping points of collapse in this overturning circulation, 25 times during the last ice age, as it tipped off and then somewhat later tipped back on again. So this can definitely happen. Why should we care? Well, if the tipping point in the AMOC were to happen, then here's an indication of what it would mean for where I am in Europe. On the left-hand plot, in the sort of bold contour lines, the black, the blue, and the red, you're seeing what are the decade or climate extremes in terms of minimum temperatures in the winter. they're minus 30 degrees centigrade in Edinburgh or minus 20 degrees centigrade in London. There are 3 completely frozen months of the year in London. There are nearly 6 frozen months of the year in Edinburgh. And yet in the summers it's going to be hotter than today, so still heat wave summers, and yet there's a kind of ice age winter. And there's an ice age winter because in this scenario, in a state-of-the-art climate model where this tipping point happens at 2 degrees of warming, in the winter the sea ice edge extends down to the black line on the right in December, the blue line in January, and the red line in February. So for me living in the UK, the sea ice is covering most of the North Sea, most of the North Atlantic, and hence the absolutely frozen conditions. In simple terms, it's very hard to see how our infrastructure would cope or would under such a radical shift in the climate. And just to take a slightly parochial British view on this, we'd previously worked out that this tipping point would eliminate the possibility for growing crops in the UK, and that would be the least of our worries because there'd be a overall drying of the climate that would mean there was in the summers a major water deficit for where all the people are in the UK around London in the southeast. So we'd have like a food and water security crisis. But in the global scale, we know that this tipping point in the AMOC would severely disrupt the monsoons in West Africa and India. Actually, when we made some simple calculations, we found that the changes in climate, drying in many key crop growing regions would radically reduce the viable area for growing these 2 staple crops, wheat and maize. In fact, they reduced it globally by more than a half. So I think that would constitute a food security crisis underlain by a water security crisis. So a summary on tipping point risks would be that we're already facing them. We're already at risk of crossing at least 5 climate tipping points. We've said this week, we think we've crossed 1. Every fraction of warming increases that risk. A 2 degrees warmer world would risk an AMOC collapse that would make much of Northwest Europe, I said they're delicately inhospitable, you might say uninhabitable, and certainly cause a sort of global food and water security crisis. My view is that, to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees C, the only really viable way to do that now is to trigger what I call positive tipping points that accelerate the change to zero emissions technologies and behaviors. And you can entertain yourself separately if you want to read the book I recently published explaining the evidence that we're already seeing those positive tipping points towards zero emissions in major sectors and markets of the economy, and outlining the policies and the actions we can all take to bring those forward. That, I think, is the most important message for maintaining a livable climate. Yeah, that's my 10 minutes, folks. Thanks for listening. And there you go. If you want to scan the QR code or go to the website and read more of the report, please do so. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tim, for helping us understand why 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius warming is a completely unsustainable goal. It's crucial that we now create new goals while implementing a new strategy that can actually help us to achieve that goal. We have already reached unsustainable tipping points, and we must now lower temperatures to sustainable levels. Cooling our planet will help us restore and protect our vital ecosystems while also protecting humanity. Okay, now to focus on the real world global impacts expected at 2 degrees Celsius, let's welcome David Spratt, Research Director at the Breakthrough National Center for Climate Restoration. David is known for his clear-eyed assessments of existential climate risks while calling for urgent systemic transformation to ensure humanity's survival. Here's David Spratt.
Thank you. I've been asked to speak briefly today about climate impacts if warming exceeds 2 degrees. And first, I just want to review some of the things we've learned today and in recent observations and science. In practical terms, warming has reached 1.5 degrees. The warming rate has quickened over the last couple of decades by around 50% from 0.2 to 0.3 per decade, perhaps a little more. 1.5 degrees has arrived 15 years ahead of the IPCC 2018 projections, which said around 2040. In other words, 15 years have been lost from the Paris emissions reduction timetable, so that, politically speaking, 2035 is the new 2050 for net zero. In terms of future warming, the rate will continue at a faster rate due to the continuing high emissions, declining only slowly to 2050 as shown in the recent production gap report, decreasing aerosols, which you've heard a lot about today, decreasing reflectivity, partly aerosols, sea ice, but also it looks like a low cloud feedback. The terrestrial carbon stores becoming less efficient, and the ocean heat sink also becoming less efficient. We also know from the literature that tipping points have been breached for the West Antarctic ice sheet, for the Greenland ice sheet, for coral reef systems, and likely for soil moisture loss. In addition, tipping points are imminent for Amazon forest, for the AMOC, for boreal forest. And we also know that current model projections do not adequately account for all reinforcing feedbacks and systemic tipping points. So how hot will it get? Today, at 1.5 and 430 parts per million CO2, climate change is already dangerous. That is, 1.5 is a political goal, not a moral or a scientific one. On present path, 2 degrees will be reached around 2040, and on present commitments, and with those feedbacks not in the system, warming will likely exceed 3 degrees. As John Schellenhuber said at a conference just recently, 1.5 is dead, 2 degrees is in agony, and 3 degrees is looming. And we know that 2.5 to 3 degrees, in fact, even 2 degrees may be enough for hothouse Earth, and at 3 degrees, we're heading towards systemic collapse. And worse still, a plausible high-end scenario is 4 degrees or more. So let's look at some snapshots of heat, and this work by Tim Lent and his colleagues on what they described in the red area, that at 2.7 degrees of warming, that is 30 or 40 years from now, those parts of the world that will show levels of heat beyond that ever experienced in human history, resulting in near unlivable conditions, which are currently only found on 1% of the Earth's planet, that is the Sahara. And by near unlivable, that is the inability to work or be outside without air conditioning, and even a lot of heat stress and difficulty inside without air conditioning systems. And translated by the World Resource Institute into cities, here's a map at 3 degrees of warming for 197 cities around the world that will experience 150 days per year or more of at least 35 degrees, and often, of course, above 40. Half of those cities are in India. And of course, that's not just about people, it's about food. And we know that temperatures exceeding 35 degrees, in some cases 33 degrees, can impair rice seed germination, pollination, and grain quality. And we'll return to this issue shortly of crop yields. There are also questions of water stress. This again from the WRI, showing extremely high dark red brown water stress areas by 2040. And in addition to those areas of extreme heat, there is also the Western United States and Canada, Mediterranean Europe, much more of Central Asia, and Northern China as well. At 2 degrees, 3 billion people experiencing chronic water scarcity. At 4 degrees, that increases to 4 billion. And coming back to food, this work on the change in land areas suitable for cropping to 2 degrees the dark brown, 3 degrees the orange. And we can see here that at 3 degrees for wheat and rice, the decrease in available land and therefore roughly yields is about 25%. And the authors conclude that beyond 22 degrees of warming, the decline in suitable areas for more than 30 crops they studied becomes pronounced. In some cases, like yams and pigeon peas and coconut and soybean, approaching 50%. And this rather stunning piece of work from the Planetary Solvency Report earlier this year on the impact of an AMOC collapse, which we may be heading for towards mid-century, and 2.5 degrees of warming on crop yields, with dark purple being a decrease in yields of 100%. And if we can see here the devastating effect on the 5 largest wheat exporting areas in the world, that is the United States and Canada, Ukraine and Russia and Australia. And of course, the transformation of natural systems as well. So this work from Strovet earlier this year. At 2.7 degrees, the Arctic would be transformed beyond contemporary recognition. The Arctic Ocean would be essentially ice-free for several months in summer. The area of Greenland that reaches melting temperatures for at least a month would roughly quadruple, and the area of permafrost would be half of what it was in pre-industrial times, and all the feedbacks, of course, that entails. And lastly, this report looking at impacts as a proportion of temperature. Temperature here, proportion of impacts felt. And we can see here at the 2 degree line, to the left of the 2 degree line, that is before 2 degrees, for 3 of the metrics, 60% of the impacts are before 2 degrees, and for another 3, 40% of the impacts are before 2 degrees. So for coral reefs, freshwater scarcity, UNESCO sites, terrestrial vegetation, staple croplands and river flooding, altogether, on average, half of the impacts before 2 degrees. And then, of course, there is sea level. This work on 2 degrees, the light red circle based on 4.7 meters, 4 degrees based on 8.9 meters. These are understatements because in the long run, sea level rises are 10 to 15 meters per degree. Nevertheless, we can see here at 4.5 meters, which Jim Hansen said he would bet $1,000 to a donut is closer to the number by 2100 than the IPCC's numbers. We see 39% of Shanghai's population, 30% of Hanoi, and 39% of Mumbai's population affected, with devastating consequences. And lastly, the impact on people of that extreme heat we looked at earlier on. So 7 countries which are largely covered by these red areas, including Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, and so on, and Indonesia, 2 billion people in those areas. And it is hard to imagine the displacement that unlivable heat will cause across those 2 billion people, leading to estimates, which of course are difficult, that warming of 2 degrees could provide 500 million people incentive to emigrate, and for 3 degrees, it could be 1 billion people. I think those numbers could actually be underdone. So in summary, where does this mean we're heading? The Chatham House Assessment Report from 2021 says without a sharp reduction in emissions before 2030, which is not and will not happen, impacts likely to be locked in for 2040, 2050, include a 30% crop in crop yields. Food demand will be 50% higher. Put those 2 numbers together and you get an unbelievable answer. 1/3 of cropland affected by severe drought each year, leading them to conclude that the cascading climate impacts will, quote, drive political instability and greater national insecurity and fuel regional and international conflict. And I think that's a polite way of putting it. And likewise, if we look at 3 degrees, we know that there will be extremes beyond all past human experience, sea level rises of tens of meters inundating both cities and deltas, large parts of the tropics suffering near unlivable heat, large parts of the dry subtropics dry out and desertify together, having catastrophic impacts on food and water security, which led in a 3 degree scenario by some US security analysts more than a decade ago to conclude that in these circumstances, and I quote, armed conflict between nations over resources is likely and nuclear war is possible. Social consequences range from increased religious fervour to outright chaos. And so just to end, what does this mean? Sir David King, who's with us today, on our current path we're still on, civilization as we know it will disappear. If we meet current commitments only, perhaps some form of humanity will survive. And Hans-Joachim Schellenhuber, a very big risk that we will just end up ending our civilization. The human species will survive somehow, but we will destroy most of what we have built up over the last 2,000 years. And I think they are sobering and realistic assessments. And thank you for your time.
Wow. Thank you, David, for that big picture overview of where we're currently heading. The implications are extremely overwhelming, but it is vital for us to understand what we're actually facing so that we can develop a new strategy that focuses on reducing temperatures to safe levels and regenerating our ecosystems to also help support humanity. Please remember that the chat box is open for reactions and clarifications, while the Q&A button is there for specific questions for our speakers. So let's go ahead and move on to the next session. Session 3, how do we avert 2 degrees Celsius by 2040? What's the plan? Now, in this segment, we will learn how much emissions reductions and greenhouse gas removals will be needed by 2040 to prevent 2 degrees Celsius. First, we'll hear from Bruce Parker, a data analyst with the Healthy Planet Action Coalition. Bruce developed his analytical foundation at MIT. He created a web-based interactive tool that enables us to explore and forecast temperature changes under different emissions scenarios. Okay, let's hear from Bruce.
Good morning. I'm Bruce Parker, a volunteer with the Healthy Planet Action Coalition. I'm pleased to be here to share my work on and results from a new way to forecast a temperature change from CO2 emissions reductions and removals, an approach designed to fill a gap I found in existing models. But before I get into the detailed analysis, I'd like to share my conclusions. First, every 10% reduction of CO2 emissions by 2040 would result in a temperature decrease of about 1/100th of 1 degree. Removing 4 billion tons of CO2 from the atmosphere by 2040 would only result in a temperature decrease of about 1/100th of a degree. As a result, aggressive CO2 reduction and removal efforts will have limited effect on the temperature increase by 2040. Since we're interested in how emissions reductions and greenhouse gas removals will affect the expected temperature increase, we need a process to forecast the expected temperature increase for any CO2 emissions pathway. I found a way to do this by analyzing the data from several global climate models. I developed 2 formulas, one to calculate the quantity of CO2 absorbed by land and ocean sinks based on atmospheric CO2, and another to calculate the temperature increase based on this atmospheric CO2. Forecasting the temperature increase is then a very simple process. You start with the current atmospheric concentration of CO2, which is about 428 parts per million. You calculate how much of that CO2 ends up in the land and ocean sinks, about 24 billion tons. You then subtract that amount from the CO2 emissions to get the CO2 added to the atmosphere, about 18 billion tons. You then adjust the concentration of atmospheric CO2, in this case of 433.3 parts per million. Finally, you calculate the expected temperature increase, in this case about 2/100ths of 1 degree. You then repeat this process for subsequent years. So now we can forecast a temperature decrease to be expected for emissions reductions and carbon dioxide removals. But first, we need a baseline CO2 emissions pathway and its temperature increase in order to calculate the decrease from CO2 emissions reductions and removals. For the baseline, we will assume CO2 emissions are unchanged from 2025 to 2040, about 42 billion tons. This table shows the expected temperature increase for 2040 through 2050 based on annual CO2 emissions of 42 billion tons. Note that the temperature increase does not include additions to the carbon dioxide feedbacks or albedo changes. First, let's look at the temperature decrease of CO2 emissions mitigation. 3 scenarios with CO2 mitigation in 2040 from 10 to 30% of 2030 CO2 emissions were created. This table also shows the additional quantity to be mitigated for every year after 2030. For example, a 10% reduction by 2040 requires mitigation efforts to increase a bit less than 500 million tons per year. By adding the temperature decrease for the years 2040 to 2050, the table can be used to explore the temperature decreases from various CO2 emissions and mitigation efforts. For example, a 10% CO2 emissions reduction in 2030 of 2030 CO2 emissions by 2040 would decrease temperature by about 1/100th of a degree in 2040. Next, let's examine the expected temperature decrease from carbon dioxide removals. Carbon dioxide removals include both CO2 removed at the source of the CO2 emissions and CO2 removed from the atmosphere. Again, 3 scenarios with CO2 removals in 2040 from 10 to 30% of 2030 emissions were created. Note that the temperature decreases here are slightly less than that for CO2 emissions mitigation, as CO2 removal does not affect the non-CO2 greenhouse gas emissions. We see here that CO2 removals of 4 billion tons by 2040 will decrease the temperature by 1/100th of 1 degree in 2040. Finally, let's look at the expected temperature decrease from non-CO2 greenhouse gas removals. This table shows the expected temperature decrease for a range of reductions in atmospheric methane. For example, reducing atmospheric methane by 10% by 2040 would decrease the global temperature by about 2/100th of a degree, not a very significant amount. Thus, we can conclude that aggressive CO2 reduction and removal efforts will have a limited effect on the temperature increase by 2040. You're welcome to contact me for further discussion at this email address. If you want to explore emission reduction scenarios, you can use my climate model emulator, which allows the user to explore many emission scenarios and adjust many of the underlying assumptions. Thank you.
Thank you for those incredibly important insights, Bruce. It is extremely important for us to have a realistic perspective on the very stark situation that we're currently facing. And the fact that emissions reductions and carbon dioxide removals currently can only have a trivial effect in helping to avert 2 degrees by 2040. Now, I'd like to welcome Paul Gamble, who developed Nori, a major carbon dioxide removals marketplace. Paul is now investigating broader approaches to coping with the climate emergency. Welcome, Paul.
Hi, I'm Paul Gamble, and I'm here to talk to you about the timeline reality as I see it and what carbon removal's role needs to be in a more comprehensive response to climate change in the 21st century. So who am I? I was the co-founder and former CEO of Nori, which was the first carbon removal marketplace that launched in 2017. I raised over $20 million for that, built up a team of 30 people, and unfortunately we wound down in 2024. But more importantly, in 2015, when I entered this field, so 10 years ago, I really believed that carbon removal was the answer to climate change. And I believed that by now in 2025, we would be capable of removing over 1 billion tons of CO2 every single year. Unfortunately, we are not there, and we're going to talk about what that means in the rest of this presentation. These days, I've been writing about carbon removal and cooling interventions at my Substack, Inevitable and Obvious. So I want to start by talking about the mental model that I was using, and I imagine that if you're working in carbon removal, you've probably been thinking about things this way too. This was a chart that the IPCC published in 2018, where for the first time, they were acknowledging that there was a need for large-scale carbon removal in order to meet our emissions targets to maintain temperature below 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees. This is an approach that thinks about carbon removal and carbon emissions from an annual emissions basis. And like I said, in 2015, I believe that this was possible. But the reality is we haven't done that. We have not made the aggressive emissions cuts, and we have certainly not scaled up on carbon removal. So we're not on those pathways. And we need to acknowledge that warming has increased and accelerated much faster than we previously thought. Because today we are already at 1.5 degrees and we are on pace to hit 2 degrees sometime in the next decade. This is not just a result of increased emissions, but is also because of loss of albedo, especially from the sulfur aerosol unmasking from changing shipping fuels in 2020. The world that we live in today in 2025 is a very different one from 2020 or 2019. And if you are still operating with the same mental model that you had back then, you need to update it. So let's talk about carbon removal and what that looks like in the near-term future. This is a hypothetical S-curve on what a scale up of the carbon removal industry could look like between now and 2050. The IPCC has set a target of reaching 10 billion tons of removal annually by 2050. And so in this hypothetical scenario, you'll note that by 2030, only 4 years from now, we should be reaching some sort of scale like hundreds of millions of tons of removal. That's just simply not going to happen. Today, we are at most doing single-digit millions of tons. This is a representation of what an almost idealized scenario would be. And I just want you to take away from this, if we were successful in doing this, it would be the largest industrial scale up humanity has ever taken on before. We're just not on path to do this. And why this matters is because even if we were successful at that, let's say that we did do that, the amount of cumulative CO2 that we would remove by then is only about 100 billion tons. Now, that's a very large number in comparison to what we're capable of doing today. But if you think about it, that's really only 2 years worth of current emissions. It's effectively making zero difference on the atmospheric carbon and the temperature that the planet is facing. And this matters because even if we were able to magically turn off all sources of emissions tomorrow, we still won't see the temperature go down. The only way to do this in the long term is by large-scale carbon removal, but I hope that I'm making the case to you that we're not on path to do that. That's not going to happen. So we are going to be sitting at this higher temperature for a long time while we are continuing to scale up CDR and bring aggressive emissions cuts online. So I want to propose that we've actually been using the wrong mental model and it's time to update it. So in the old version, we were looking at annual CO2 emissions as the main metric that we're thinking about and that we're targeting. And what I would propose is you need to shift to start thinking about temperature. And temperature matters because of tipping point risks. So these are problems that exist today. And the unfortunate thing is, over the years, many of these tipping point risks in different Earth systems that we previously thought were going to be more of a risk at higher temperatures are actually more likely to impact us sooner. So most immediately, very recently, it was announced that it appears like we have crossed the tipping point for saving tropical coral reefs. And we are also potentially facing collapse of AMOC and permafrost methane release in this 1.5 to 2 degree range, which we are already at today. So we are very much in the danger zone for many of these tipping point risks. Temperature is what matters. And when we look at this, there is a huge gap. So carbon removal is not going to come online fast enough to make a difference in the overall temperature of the planet. We're not going to see significant cooling impacts from carbon removal until probably the next century. So we have this dangerous situation today, but the solution that we've been proposing is the long-term solution, isn't actually capable of meeting that challenge in the time that we need it to. So we need to start talking about how can we lower the temperature in the meantime to buy us more time. Sunlight reflection methods are the way to do this. And this is not a solution instead of carbon removal. This is about buying us more time for carbon removal to scale up. So we need to be thinking about a much more holistic climate response that is about aggressively reducing our emissions, removing our past legacy emissions, and reflecting sunlight in the meantime to buy time for the first two. We cannot get out of this danger zone and avoid some of the worst potential effects of climate change without adopting all three of these techniques. CDR still, though, is the long-term solution. So this is the only way that we're ever going to solve this long term, in part because SRM, sunlight reflection, doesn't do anything for dealing with problems of ocean acidification. And we need to be able to scale down SRM. We cannot do it forever. We don't want to do it forever. And the way to do that is to scale down SRM alongside scaling up carbon removal. So it's still the most important long-term thing for us to be doing. The problem, though, is that we have built an industry of carbon removal that is financed by venture capital, and we are selling carbon removal credits to companies that are trying to make claims about their present day carbon emissions. But when you zoom out and look at the bigger picture, these things don't really matter all that much in comparison. So we need to start thinking about this. And I'm not the first to say this, but we need to be thinking about different and alternative financing mechanisms for carbon removal that are not built off the backs of venture capitalists, because that short-term return prospect is not sufficient to meet the scale that we need. We also need to start being much more honest about the claims that we're making about how much of an impact carbon removal can have by the middle of the century. And I recognize that this is very frustrating if you're running a carbon removal business, because it's going to make fundraising more difficult. It's going to make it more difficult to sell your products. But unfortunately, this is the only way for us to actually grapple with the problem of climate change in the 21st century as it exists today. We need to start thinking about alternative ways of doing this. And I also want to advocate that if you are working in carbon removal, you are in a very unique position to advocate for sunlight reflection to buy more time, because you are the only industry that understands the scaling timelines, all of the challenges in getting this up to speed, the difference between what it means to pilot something versus actual deployment reality, and how difficult it is to actually pay for this. The carbon removal industry needs more time to scale up, and sunlight reflection is the only way that we can buy more time for that. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. That was such a thorough explanation of why it's so crucial for us to have a holistic approach to our strategy. In order for our crucial overarching net negative strategy to work in time to restore safe temperatures for humanity, for our ecosystems, we must also integrate reflection into that plan. Next, we will turn to Brian von Herzen. He is of the Climate Foundation and also a wonderful member of the Healthy Planet Action Coalition. Brian will fill us in on the potential for ocean-based removals to contribute to eventually stabilizing planetary temperatures while also restoring a safe ecosystem in the oceans. Thank you, Brian.
Well, thank you, Aria, and it's great to be here today. Paul is right. We're going to need to address all three legs of the climate triad in order to really be able to sustain the temperatures that are going to be needed to keep our civilization on track. I have some slides that will show this in vivid detail. And the key question is, how can we address all three legs of the climate triad in the oceans? And that in particular, that is emissions reduction, carbon removal, and climate repair. So I'll describe some of the work that we're doing at the Climate Foundation and how that can, what the ramifications are for oceans in general in terms of emission reduction, carbon removal, and climate repair. Our vision is to be able to address this from a food security standpoint with sustainable livelihoods, especially in the global south, focusing on ecosystem regeneration, nature-based carbon removals, and of course, climate repair aspects, as have been touched on earlier today. Now, the oceans have a huge challenge, and the challenge is that we're dealing with over 95% of our kelp forests are lost in places like Australia and the United States. And at the same time, over 93% of global warming is going into the oceans today, as shown in the top left. On the bottom left, you can see that this has greatly affected sardine populations off of California and across the Pacific. And in addition, it has profound effects on seaweed production. In Asia, which is a multi-billion-dollar market, we've seen losses of over 60% in tropical seaweeds and over 90% in temperate seaweeds. Our solution is to try to address the nutrient value chain gaps that exist in the ocean. Excess heating in the ocean has actually reduced the availability of nutrients that are available just below the surface, about 100 meters down. And so we use the seaweed platforms to access nutrients in the mesopelagic region, which is the region from 100 meters to 1,000 meters below the surface. And this we've done with a series of platforms, including this 1,000 square meter platform shown on the left. And more recently this year, we've deployed a 2,500 square meter platform that is able to go down at night, absorb nutrients, and up at sunrise to absorb sunlight and carbon dioxide in the top meter of the sea. Some of these seaweed products have a profound effect on our agriculture. And it turns out our agriculture produce more than 1,000 megatons of carbon dioxide equivalent every year. This is a really profound impact when it comes to our food production. And what's significant is that we can use marine products like seaweed to actually reduce that carbon intensity and reduce emissions. Just for context, this is a picture of our platform and elevation view showing how we lower the seaweed at night, absorb nutrients, and lift the seaweed up during the day and absorb carbon dioxide and sunlight in the top meter of the sea. One of the products we make is a seaweed foliar biostimulant, and what's significant about this is it's able to actually increase crop yields by 15 to 30% while decreasing the use of fertilizers by over 20%. In addition, there's some significant benefits associated with the ability to withstand hurricanes while still producing seaweed. I will say about the seaweed foliar biostimulants is that the greenhouse gassing forces of agricultural emissions are profound. And if we can cut emissions by around 1/3 by using products like this and reduce the amount of fertilizer required, that actually has a profound effect on reducing our agricultural emissions and reducing carbon emissions from agricultural in general. In addition to the carbon emissions, in fact, I've got a photo of those emissions here. This is an example of reduced carbon intensity, and that is the vertical axis is showing the fertilizer specific yield, and that is the tons of produce divided by the tons of fertilizer. And the orange graphs are the control regions, and the blue bars represent the actual test with the biostimulant that we're able to dramatically reduce the carbon intensity of the production by a factor of 2 to a factor of 6. And that is sacks of rice divided by sacks of fertilizer. It has a profound effect. So we've got this benefit in the top right of reduced emissions. In the bottom left, we have an example where approximately a quarter of the seaweed falls off the platform during growth and sinks 1,000 meters a day to the abyssal seafloor, where it can remain for centuries. Now, the oceans are unique in that they store more than 40 times more carbon dioxide than the entire atmosphere, which means that if we took all of the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and distributed it evenly throughout the oceans, it would change the CO2 level in the oceans by just 2.5%. So our challenge and our opportunity is actually to get carbon dioxide out of the surface ocean and into the middle and deep ocean where it can be diluted suitably. And that presents a true blue carbon sink that we need to do a lot more with by using ecosystems like kelp forests, tropical seaweed forests, and coral reefs, along with plankton in the ocean, and make sure those ecosystems are working well so that, in fact, nature can continue to fix as much carbon as she has been in previous decades and centuries pre-industrially. That covers the second leg of the climate triad. Now we want to talk briefly about the third leg, and that is climate repair. And Leon Simons and others have described very aptly the amazing effect that aerosols have in warming the earth and warming the ocean. This is a profound effect, and as you can see, the shipping was a major contributor to marine aerosols until 2023, but no longer, and that's a really significant factor. These ships produced ship tracks, which caused more clouds, and those clouds actually reflected more sunlight, and that was very effective until about 2023, at which time the International Maritime Organization cut the sulfur emissions, and that had a profound effect. And it only took about 6 months for the ocean warming to occur and for the heating to have a profound effect after 2020, when those regulations went into place. Now, within just 6 months, we saw temperatures of +5 degrees Celsius in the North Sea. We saw temperatures exceeding 101 Fahrenheit in the Florida Keys. And more recently, in 2025, the International Maritime Organization cut aerosols in the Mediterranean. And within 2 months of May 1st, 2025, in July, we saw temperatures exceeding 8.5 degrees Celsius warmer of heating in the Western Mediterranean, particularly in the northern part. And that had a profound effect on the ecosystems in the Mediterranean. So that's a real challenge. And the question is, we don't propose to restore fossil fuel aerosols. However, with a combination of biogenic cloud condensation nuclei coming from algae and sea spray, we can actually restore the level of natural aerosols that could actually do a lot towards climate repair, as Paul Gamble said, while we're getting our carbon budget back into balance. And to that extent, this is an example of showing our seaweed platforms that are able to produce the biogenic cloud condensation nuclei that come from microalgae plankton, and they come from macroalgae seaweed, and actually regenerate those over the ocean so that our coastal regions into hundreds of kilometers inland can benefit from increased clouds locally and actually restore the cloud levels that have been lost in previous years. And because the earth is dimmer and duller than it was just 20 years ago, and work to actually get these re-brighten our oceans and our coastlines and our interior regions, and actually get the clouds back in place that can reflect more sunlight and give us time to reduce our emissions to zero, give us time to remove 2,400 gigatons of carbon from the atmosphere and put them into the middle and deep ocean and into soils from whence they came, and ultimately to get back to carbon balance for our society and civilization. With that, I want to thank our many contributors around the world who have contributed significantly to enabling marine permaculture and more to address all three legs of the climate triad as we work towards regenerating healthy climate. And with that, I'll thank you and look forward to questions in the chat and further discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brian. I love how your strategy is so holistic, while it also integrates the health of our oceans and our soils. Very forward thinking. Thank you so much for being with us today. Now we are going to hear from Dr. Starry Sprinkle Hippolyte. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Hopefully she will correct me. Restoration Science Senior Director at Conservation International. Starry will update us on the highest potential for managed and natural terrestrial systems to absorb carbon dioxide at a large scale. Natural climate solutions for rapid carbon removal and global cooling. Okay, thank you, Starry. Clearly, our ecosystems have a massive potential to draw down carbon as they provide valuable ecosystem services and livelihood benefits. Let's hear from Starry.
Thank you, Aria, for that kind introduction, and Dennis for the invitation to join this prestigious group of presenters today, and to the people who are tuning in. I'm happy to share a little bit about natural climate solutions for rapid carbon removal and global cooling. I grew up in California. This is one of my favorite places in the world. It's called Underwood Road. This area is called Corral de Tierra, named by the early Spanish-speaking settlers who kept cows in these hills, and it formed a natural corral for them, hence Corral de Tierra. It didn't look like this when they arrived in the 1700s. It was much more densely wooded with oak and chaparral or sagebrush. This wild oak grass that makes California's famous Golden Hills golden in the summertime was introduced from Spain, and it was planted as lands were cleared for grazing. At this point, they've been grazed for hundreds of years, but when it gets hot in the summer, the grass stays greener for longer under the trees. The cows cluster around them. It's better to be under wood when you're walking out Underwood Road, and perhaps everywhere. Nature is trying to help, and she can in many ways that I will describe to you, despite all the damage we have already done. We just need to let her. Since 2020, I've been working for Conservation International, an environmental nonprofit with a team of more than 1,600 people across about 30 country programs, primarily focused on scaling nature-based solutions in the global south. We work with communities, scientists, governments, and the private sector to protect and restore nature for the benefit of humanity, thinking about nature-positive economies to balance sustainable production with protection and restoration of nature. Both nature and tech, and by tech, in this sense, we mean alternative energy and emissions reductions, are needed to reach the Paris climate goals. Now, our strong position is that photosynthesis is the best carbon dioxide removal technology currently available. Nature is an important part of the climate solution. 1/3 of it, according to the 2017 article that defined natural climate solutions and divided them into 3 major categories: protect, manage, and restore, related to protecting intact areas, improving management of working lands, for example, farmland and grazing land and lands in forestry. Now, their total potential was estimated to be 1/3 of the needed cost-effective climate mitigation to keep global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Removals are needed to slow down global heating. Conservation International updated this work in 2022 as part of the Exponential Roadmap Initiative, which focused on what actions people need to take to realize the massive potential of these solutions. It focused on mobilizing public and private enabling actors or institutions to support people on the land with money, information, or policy to take actions for critical climate outcomes, while also benefiting biodiversity and food security. So what action should people take? There are 8 action tracks across the categories of protection, climate smart management, and ecosystem restoration, which can deliver more than 13 gigatons of mitigation annually by 2030, and far more in 2040 and 2050. Now, nearly all of the action tracks in the manage and restore categories, the pink and the purple ones on the right side here, provide significant opportunities for rapid carbon removal into natural plant biomass, and many of them also provide direct adaptation and cooling benefits. Majority of this carbon removal potential, more than 5 gigatons, is in climate-smart farming and grazing. This includes both agroforestry and regenerative practices that primarily increase soil carbon, like cover cropping and improved grazing rotations. These actions provide carbon dioxide removal while ensuring food security. Most importantly, they will simultaneously also cool and stabilize the land surface below them, contributing to the stability of future climates and food security. Best of all, they are ready to deploy immediately. They don't require any new technology. I will elaborate on one of the natural climate solutions with the highest global potential, increasing tree cover in agriculture. This includes increasing agroforestry or silvopasture practices in ways that do not reduce food production and don't put trees into systems that can't sustain it. If you're already a fan of agroforestry and silvopasture, you know that's possible. But many people would question whether you can increase tree cover without reducing food yields. Most of us know that there are pluses and minuses to integrating trees into systems, and finding the right tree density depends on a lot of trade-offs and the local conditions. On the one hand, trees provide shelter and improve soil and water conditions by cooling off the soil under them, but they may also compete with crops for light and water and space. It's a delicate and highly context-dependent balancing act. How could you generalize about these complex systems to come up with recommendations? There's this carbon versus food debate, but I'd like to say that it's a false choice. Our guiding carbon versus food question in more technical terms was, what is the climate mitigation potential for increasing tree cover in agriculture without significantly reducing long-term yields? We reached out to experts and consulted them on maximum tree densities in different cropping systems that wouldn't reduce yields. And then we used spatial analyses to define the potential increases in tree cover and the carbon sequestration potential. We reached out to hundreds of experts on agroforestry and asked them to fill out a carefully designed questionnaire that is summarized in the top image. It boiled down to how many trees of what size would you put on a hectare, or how far apart would you plant the trees in a grid pattern with no decrease in agricultural yields. We did this for the major earth biomes, and as you can see in the bottom left, the overall average recommendation was around 25% tree cover. Now, there's a lot of variation in the data, which isn't surprising because there are many different potential combinations of trees and crops that will interact in different ways. But we wanted to leave the details up to the locals and just come up with that big picture target. Then we compared the experts' recommendations to the current existing levels of tree cover and croplands on the left and grazing lands on the right, and extrapolated how much tree carbon could be added by increasing tree cover up to those expert recommended levels. As you can see, there are margins for improvements across the globe, from temperate, especially in croplands, to tropical regions. The bottom line is this: there are 2.6 billion hectares of agricultural land where we could increase tree cover without reducing yields. And this would remove more carbon than the annual global emissions from cars. And now we're working on catalyzing this critical work on the ground. But that's just one example of our current work to increase carbon removal through restorative actions. We also have our eyes on natural forest regeneration. We've been predicting where it is most likely to occur and working on strategies to maximize carbon removal from reforestation in ways that benefit local people. Which brings me back to cows and grazing, but in tropical forest regions where reforestation can generate even more carbon removals than silvopasture per hectare. Natural climate solutions must guarantee continued livelihoods for people, and there are many options to solve for this when you think about it, and we are. Trees give us shade and can be a big benefit to crops and grazers, especially in hot, dry conditions. At the same time, they're removing carbon from the atmosphere. They're part of adapting to future climates. Besides their direct cooling effects, they can have indirect global cooling effect through carbon dioxide removal, as illustrated by the last paper I will be showing you. Natural climate solutions are often criticized because they can be vulnerable to destruction or reversal, for example, by fire. And while best practices make allowances for these risks while still ensuring adequate long-term removals, this important paper by Matthews et al. Shows that even if the worst case scenario happens and the living carbon in trees goes up in smoke somewhere down the line, the temporary benefit that they can provide in the next few decades would still play a critical role in keeping global temperatures down, reducing that peak temperature increase, even when you account for some surface warming that they may cause due to albedo, in a world where fossil fuel emission reductions also occur. So in my humble opinion, there is literally no reason not to get started on this immediately. Please reach out if you have comments or questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Starry. Clearly, our ecosystems have a massive potential to draw down carbon while also restoring valuable ecosystems and benefiting humanity. This also highlights how essential it is that we conserve our current vital ecosystems, especially our rainforests. Now, we will have our first Q&A session. Dennis, please come on in and help us present the audience questions to our speakers.
Okay, Aria, thank you. Many of our speakers are online with us, and so we've been harvesting questions that can be addressed to each of them. Our first question is for Leon Simons, our first speaker. Leon, you and Dr. Hansen have both noted that the pollution from shipping has had a very big cooling effect that has, until recently, reduced the rate of temperature increase quite substantially. Could you elaborate for us on how you might change the regulations to allow heavier sulfate emissions over the open oceans in order to be able to slow the rate of warming and contribute to our decrease in the accelerated global heating? Leon?
Hi,
There you go.
does it work? Yes. Sorry.
Yes, you're on screen.
Like later.
Did
Okay.
you did you hear the question?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So of course these
Shipping.
rules, the shipping rules. Yes, you asked about the shipping rules and whether we can. I think the question is first whether it's possible to change these rules, of course, and even the question preceding that is whether we should. And as I explained last time, of course, the evidence we put forward based on these NASA satellites shows that there's a very strong cooling impact of these shipping emissions, and especially over certain regions of the planet where these stratocumulus clouds are. So what could be done is that these, for example, those ships will be allowed to emit sulfur further from the coast, so the health impacts and the emissions, the environmental impacts of acid rain, for example, will be very much limited, but the cooling impact will remain. So that's of course a technical possibility, and what we would need for that, of course, is first we really need to be able to see what happens. So we need the right satellites in orbit. We need to secure these NASA Sirius satellites. I think we should work together with different space agencies to launch more of these satellites, and because otherwise you don't know what you're doing. So that's really crucial. And also, of course, weather observations and many other observations are needed to be certain that once there are impacts, it will be mitigated. The risk will be mitigated. And then, of course, I don't think we are there yet, but once countries realize how much these impacts, how enormous these impacts are, that we have in the past 15 years see more regional warming than in the preceding 150 years over these regions where the shipping emissions were reduced. once this warming and starts to impact people where they live, I do think there will be more and more discussion on what needs to be next, and if there will be the serious risk analyses, both looking at the risk of emitting more sulfur over the open oceans or not doing it. I do think that eventually there might be some policy decisions to do it, and of course those are enormous decisions to make, and it's very scientifically you can analyze it, but very much political decision. And yes, I'm not an expert in these political debates about these very delicate subjects, but yeah, I would like to learn more about it myself in the years ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Leon. Yeah, there's a lot of work to be done on this issue. We have a question from Michael Pilarski, and this is addressed to Starry. He's asking if you could address the destruction of the biosphere as a cause of global warming. The loss of forests, soils, and plant cover is a major forcer of climate change, and you mentioned this in your presentation, but what benefit can be obtained by restoring forests, soils, and plant cover over the coming decades? Starry?
Thank you. Yeah, that's an excellent question. We've been looking at it a lot in the Amazon, for instance. The Amazon forest, as an intact forest, is critical for regulating not just the temperature, but also the water cycling throughout the Americas. And so this is part of the kind of interaction you can get, putting you towards the tipping point. When you have the forest destruction, you're actually losing a lot of the water pumping and dispersion to different parts of the Americas. So it has, then things get drier or less predictable, and then it makes it harder for forests to go back. And we're, getting closer and closer to a tipping point in the Amazon becoming a savanna, right? And so we're looking at it from a few different angles. We definitely have people working on the contribution of forests to the stabilization of the climate, intact forests. The science and the climate science behind how restoration and reforestation can actually reverse this is still primarily theoretical, right? But it requires the work on the projections of increasing tree cover, and then those interactions that like you see in the Matthews et al. Work, which we have other climate scientists on the line here and would love to hear any thoughts they have on that. But the loss of forests can also lead to the loss of soils, and soil erosion is actually a huge cause of emissions. There's a lot of carbon that is stored in soils, forest soils, and also wetland soils and peatland soils. And so we actually have a ton of emissions from soils, from land use changing, from draining wetlands or peatlands, from the climate change in the Arctic as well, and the permafrost breaking up and releasing a lot of greenhouse gases. So it's definitely a very rapidly accelerating, scary cycle when you keep on going with the massive land conversion and the disruptions that are just coming from the changes in climates, like the changes in the boreal regions. So I really think we need to do everything we can to stop and reverse the forest losses in the places where forests have been and are critical to supporting the climate. Hope that answers the question. Thank you.
Okay, Starry, thank you also. We have a question from Veli Albert Kallio, who is interested in the fact that President Donald Trump has claimed that there is no noticeable climate change. And Veli observes that had the IMO not reduced sulfate levels, there would be even more arguments that there is indeed a climate scan. Maybe I could address this question to Brian, since you also mentioned sulfur dioxide in your presentation. How would you address this problem if sulfur dioxide is put back into the atmosphere and then temperature increase is reduced or is deflated from what is happening now? Brian?
Well, thank you for that question, Dennis. We're not proposing to restore fossil sulfates in the atmosphere. The aerosol termination shock that occurred as a result of the International Maritime Organization actions highlights how quickly the Earth and ocean system responds to changes in aerosols and how big the effect is. So let's deal with the present world, and that is we've unmasked the dramatic effect that greenhouse gases and aerosols have on our climate. And I think in many ways the IPCC has underestimated the sensitivity of our planet to greenhouse gases and the sensitivity of our planet to aerosols. So we've got this answer. That's the world we're living in now. Why don't we use nature-based aerosols that come from forests? The pine forest smell is from terpenes. Terpenes produce the cloud condensation nuclei that give you clouds over mountains. And over the ocean are algae forests, plankton forests, and kelp forests, and other seaweeds contribute massively to the cloud condensation nuclei that create marine clouds that reflect sunlight back into space. And so there are plenty of nature-based solutions to restoring the aerosol levels that can actually show the way towards keeping our climate cool while we get our carbon budget back into balance. So it's a huge opportunity. And I do want to take a moment to say we need to approach these problems from an abundance standpoint. In other words, by creating abundant renewable energy, as China has done, bringing the cost down by 93% of the solar modules, for example, and being able to make that available globally, we can have an abundance of renewable energy that will make it simply uneconomic to continue running fossil fuels much longer, especially if we eliminate fossil fuel subsidies. So that combination is huge. And then secondly, if we have now at our disposal the means for abundant food production on the planet, using, by some estimates, including George Monbiot in his book Regenesis, 70 times less land area, while we are feeding 10 billion people, and we can rewild most of that pasture land, as was said by Starry in the Conservation International presentation. By rewilding and reforesting, we can sink massive amounts of carbon in our soils, and we create not only food for 10 billion people, but habitat for 8 million species. So this is a triple win. So let's approach energy from an abundance standpoint and how we can bring the cost of renewable energy down, not only below fossil fuels where they are today, but 10 times cheaper than fossil fuels, which is achievable in the next 10 years. And then secondly, bring the abundance of food through precision agrivoltaics and the silvopasture that Starry so aptly described, and others. Agrivoltaics is vertical bifacial solar panels and vegetables and crops in between. So we can do that as well. And then furthermore, precision fermentation can get us huge amounts of protein at decreasing cost. The cost of precision fermentation, think of it like beer fermentation, but you're producing protein. Well, that cost $100 a kilo in 2020. It costs $10 a kilo today. And in 5 years, the cost of that protein will be $1 a kilo, which makes it cheaper than livestock. So that means 80% of our protein in 5 or 10 years will be coming from fermentation and not from the fields. That enables us to rewild. And so it's this abundance of energy and abundance of food that is going to get us towards a great carbon removal solution. And I think it's through abundance messaging, as evidenced by the book Stellar by my colleagues Tony Seba and James Arbib, that was just published this year, that really describes great ways that through abundance we can get towards emissions to zero, 2,400 gigatons of carbon removal, and climate repair on sea and on land while we're getting our carbon budget back into balance. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. I have a question here for Paul Gamble. Paul, you mentioned that depending on venture capital for developing the CDR industry just isn't going to increase the scale of CDR rapidly enough to produce levels of CO2 in the atmosphere necessary to bring temperatures down. That begs the question, what other financing options do you think may exist that could do this? Paul? Paul, are you there? Yeah, I think I saw. Paul Gamble, are you there?
Yes, here.
Okay.
I'm here.
Yeah, did you hear my question?
I'm sorry, I did not.
Okay, let me repeat that. During your presentation, you mentioned that depending on venture capital for developing the CDR industry isn't going to increase the scale of CDR rapidly enough to be consequential in bringing temperatures down in the coming decades. That begs the question of what other financing options do you think may exist that could do this?
Yeah, this has been a discussion that's been going on in the carbon removal world for a while now. And I mean, a lot of people point to project finance as a potential opportunity similar to the kinds of things that were done for renewable energy over the last several decades. I have to believe that at some point, direct government financing is going to be like critically necessary. The voluntary carbon market is something that I very much believed in for a very long time and was very, very effective in getting us to where we are today. But I don't necessarily believe that that's the same approach that we're going to be able to take for reaching 10, 20, 50 gigatons of scale. So it's tough to hear because that's not where our politics is at the moment, and it's sort of hard to imagine how we get to that point. But I just don't really see any other potential solution for the long-term scaling need.
Yeah. So government direct investment will be the next frontier from your point
Maybe
of view.
maybe the second next frontier. Probably project finance and other sort of debt instruments are going to be potentially more useful in the near term, but long term, yes.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Paul. I have a question for Bruce Parker, and I know, Bruce, you're online. Bruce, you've shown that even if emissions reduction were to dramatically decrease, or emissions reduction were to dramatically increase, and carbon removals were to ramp up rapidly, they will still have a very small effect in reducing the rate of temperature increase and averting 2 degrees. Now, if this is the case, would sunlight reflection be an alternative that could stop the rise in temperature below 2 degrees? Bruce? There you are.
Bruce is muted.
You're muted, Bruce. Unmute at the up on the top of your screen. Your
Okay.
mic. Yeah,
There you go.
okay.
Okay.
Good.
Yeah, the question is how fast you could think through that.
Yeah.
Sunlight reflection could bring the temperature down by a little bit by 2040, but the question there is how fast could you actually implement solar radiation management? How quickly could that ramp be up? It's only 15 years from now. But certainly in the years after 2040 through 2050, 2060, it probably is the only way to bring the temperature back down and get it under 2 degrees and back towards 1.5.
Yep. Yep. Okay. I have another question for Brian Van Herzen. Brian, let's see. Brian, there is quite a range of views on the potential of ocean fertilization and marine permaculture to absorb very large quantities of carbon dioxide in the oceans. From They range from about 1 billion tons per year up to 60 billion tons per year. What is your assessment of this technical potential for ocean sequestration?
Thank you for that question, Dennis. I think there is great potential because if you look at just the photosynthesis that happens on our planet historically, the first lung of ocean planet Earth is on land, and the second lung is in the sea. Around half the oxygen produced and half the carbon fixed is happening in the oceans on an ongoing basis. So there's a great natural potential for it. Now, we have to recognize that due to ocean warming, we've seen a decrease in primary production photosynthesis of 30 to 40% in the Pacific Ocean alone, in the subtropical regions of the Pacific, which comprise more than 100 million square kilometers. So we have to recognize that just in the last century, we've seen, due to ocean warming and stratification from the warm ocean layers at the surface, a decrease of 30 to 40%. So I would ask the question, how do we get back to the pre-industrial levels of productivity that we had in the oceans just less than a century ago? And I would add, pre-industrial levels of productivity on land, the photosynthesis of forests, an old growth forest. So that's our first challenge, is to get back to where we were pre-industrially. And we estimate that if we were to triple the area under deep water irrigation, like the marine permaculture depicted behind me, if we were to triple it each year for the next dozen years, we can reach a gigaton of carbon fixation in the mid to late 2030s. And that is a significant goal. So I would say, let's get to 1 gigaton. And then our next generation can actually figure out, okay, let's figure out what is the sustainable speed and feeds on land and in the sea for nature-based carbon removals that is sustainable and practical. So let's just set the marker at 1 gigaton and then go up from there in terms of the annual removals that are possible on sea and land. So I'm enthused. I think there's a huge amount that nature can do on all three legs of the climate triad. And I have to emphasize, James Hansen's right. 1.5 is dead. Even 2 degrees is dead. And what we need to do is address not only, we've got to address first and foremost climate repair. And that can happen with nature-based solutions like submicron sea spray, like biogenic aerosols that come from kelp forests, and the terrestrial aerosols that come from terrestrial forests. And once we have that in place, which will put a lid on, we know that response time is 6 months based on the inadvertent experiment by the International Maritime Organization on our oceans and our climate. We know that response time is very fast. And now the opportunity, once we have that in place, is to actually address the emissions to zero and the carbon removals that we'll need to get back to healthy climate. So we need all three legs of that triad. And at this point, we've got to put climate repair front and center, and that's local and regional climate repair that we can work transparently with communities to put in place for those communities that would like to lead the way on regenerating healthy climate in our lifetime. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. And we're out of time for this Q&A segment. We have another 1 or 2 questions, which we will drop into the next Q&A, which will be coming up soon. So at this point, Aria, let me turn it back to you to continue the presentations.
Okay, great. Thank you, Dennis. So our next section will be deploying a new climate plan. And I also just wanted to comment for a moment, that question about Donald Trump, to me, really highlighted the importance of effective communication to be integrated into all of the work that so many amazing people are doing when they're addressing climate, that we really need to, up the ante when it comes to effective communication to dispel various types of climate denial so that we can support effective action. And that brings us to our final segment, which centers on collective action, how governments, organizations, and communities can work together to deploy a truly integrated global climate plan. Now, I'm honored to present Dr. Mike McCracken, Chief Scientist for Climate Change Programs at the Climate Institute and Chief Scientist for the Healthy Planet Action Coalition. Mike has spent decades leading climate change modeling studies at the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory and the Office of the U.S. Global Climate Change Research Program, and is a contributing author to IPCC assessment reports. He will discuss why we need a new climate plan. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you. A third of a century ago, the international community agreed to the Framework Convention on Climate Change, which pledges to avoid dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. Since then, however, global emissions have about doubled and they're still going up. About the same time, scientists provided convincing confirmation that human-induced emissions were indeed, as projected 100 years earlier, increasing the global average temperature. Now, in 2025, the global average temperature is about 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial, and the rate of rise seems to be growing. Warming is now projected to reach 2 degrees C by around 2040, and to reach roughly double the present level of warming later in the 21st century. These seemingly small temperature changes really hide, however, how these changes will affect the Earth's environment and the people around the world. What is very clear is that accelerating climate change, which seems inevitable given present trends and approaching tipping points, has the potential to be catastrophic for ecosystems and national economies. Very few nations seem likely to be immune from major impacts, and so more intensive efforts to gain control of climate change are urgently needed. To date, the primary focus has been on reducing global emissions of CO2. While all nations seem to be trying and renewables are becoming less costly, most nations are finding it difficult for economic reasons, for practical reasons, sometimes for political reasons, to rapidly transition to a non-greenhouse gas emitting energy system. While more can and needs to be done and should be done, given the limited progress, there's slow progress at least, it really seems time to face the reality that is going to take until well into the second half of the 21st century to get close to net zero. And over the decades it takes to do that, ocean overturning is likely to slow, permafrost thawing will emit more CO2 and methane into the atmosphere, forests and oceans will probably take up less CO2, and these will all tend to sustain or even accelerate the pace of global warming. A growing number of us, especially those of us with the Healthy Planet Action Coalition, have come to the conclusion that the catastrophic consequences of warming past 2 degrees Celsius are simply too risky and should be unacceptable for society. Indeed, even continuing conditions at the aspirational peak warming level of 1.5 degrees called for in the Paris Accord seems like too much warming. So what additional efforts might contribute to a credible plan for staying below 2 degrees C and setting the stage for improving approaches over time and, if determined to be needed, moving toward warming of 1 degree C or even less by the mid-century, mid-21st century and beyond. Previous speakers have talked about some potential approaches for moderating the increasing risks of catastrophic consequences, approaches that research shows are likely to be net beneficial or at least less detrimental than the path that the world is currently on, with temperatures rising into a domain that we just have no experience with. Lessons from the study of Earth's climate history make clear that the goal needs to not only keep warming below 2 degrees Celsius, but to also pull it back toward 1 degrees, perhaps, and then, depending on a comparative risk analysis, something we adjust and figure out along the way, likely back toward less than 1 degree C warming over following decades. So what might a credible and comprehensive implementation and deployment plan include that would focus particularly on offsetting warming over the next 15 years and be able to help in the period beyond? Well, first, as noted earlier and is being pursued, ongoing mitigation efforts need to be accelerated, especially those that can have very near-term effects. So what are these? Well, first is reducing emissions of short-lived greenhouse gases. It's a relatively hidden opportunity. UNEP report a decade ago showed that it could probably help pull temperatures down by about 0.5 degrees C. The focus needs to be on cutting emissions of methane and the nitrogen oxides and volatile hydrocarbons that lead to air pollution and tropospheric ozone. Cutting coal mine and gas line leakage is pretty straightforward. Capturing emissions from waste disposal facilities, sewage systems, and agriculture also all present significant opportunities. Something not much talked about is matching reductions in coal plant and freighter emissions of SO2 with reductions in emissions of black carbon that darken snow and ice surfaces. And there's potential for doing this, and it will help reduce health and other impacts. I'll talk in a moment about perhaps adding SO2 back or some bright reflecting aerosols in as a climate intervention approach. Another thing that would be important and needs prioritization is reversing deforestation and promoting reforestation. This is not just to reduce CO2 emissions and concentrations, but also to sustain the natural uptake of CO2 by forests. We really don't want to get on a path where a greater fraction of CO2 is remaining in the atmosphere. And then, of course, we still certainly want to reduce CO2 emissions, and the best way to do it probably is facilitating growth of renewables to replace the existing system. This is also essential, of course, for reducing ocean acidification. But facilitating growth of renewables is important. One way is perhaps better transmission lines. So virtually all of these and some other approaches are underway, but to really pull down near-term radiative forcing, more attention is needed on the approaches beyond just cutting CO2 emissions. The second general area, which is being looked at a little bit at least, is to look at pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere. Now, the least expensive way to keep CO2 down is to just keep the fossil fuels in the ground. So we really want to try and push for that. But all the viable scenarios that are talked about for limiting climate change are based on pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere. And the energy needed to do this is a critical challenge for these approaches. The only potential cost-effective approaches at the moment now take advantage of nature. So nature having used solar energy to capture CO2. It may have captured it in forests, and so you can use forest and agricultural waste products. It may be used to capture, grow plants in the ocean. And then what is done is to convert the products into biochar. And this can have a beneficial effect for farmers by enriching the soils and helping agricultural production, so help pays for what is being done. Another potential area that needs some intensified research is whether ocean fertilization can actually pull up CO2 out of the atmosphere and sequester it in the oceans, in the deep ocean preferably, for centuries. A key question then for both types of sequestration, is if they work, can they be scaled up rapidly? And this is just not known. What has to happen is emissions have to come down dramatically to make these a real contribution to cooling instead of just reducing warming. And then the third approach, and no countries are out there wanting further warming or more extreme weather or drenching rains or faster sea level rise. The only near-term approach to exerting a cooling influence to counterbalance further warming is climate intervention, or sometimes called solar radiation management or just geoengineering. There are a range of approaches, so I use climate intervention. Presently, this is not really included in the international set of policy options, even though there appear to be several possibilities with near-term potential. The most researched approach and most talked about approach is stratospheric aerosol intervention, which in a controlled, smooth, and ongoing way tries to imitate how major volcanic eruptions exert a cooling influence. Now, people talk about how much solar reduction is needed. Offsetting the present rate of warming would require reflecting only about 0.2% of solar radiation for each decade that these present high rate of emissions continues. So it's a relatively modest effect that would be hard to see for the average individual. Model simulations and present technical capabilities suggest that with an intensive engineering effort, SAI could be started in the mid to high latitudes, at least by the early 2030s, and that this would lead to a relatively well-distributed reduction in warming. The cooling that is extra in high latitudes due to ice albedo feedback would tend to pull heat out of lower latitudes. Starting such an SAI effort as soon as possible, I think, is what is really needed. And then we would learn and adjust as experience develops, and that this would seem to have fewer risks, fewer uncertainties, and fewer adverse impacts than proceeding on the current path without climate intervention, which, as I noted, goes into warming levels not experienced by civilization. Other potentially high leverage approaches which seem plausible for getting some cooling have really only been tested and examined in the laboratory. And so they need intensified examination with climate models and through some modest field experiments. These approaches sort of include injection of aerosol catalyst to accelerate the chemical destruction of methane, injection of sea salt aerosol to brighten clouds, which is an approach being used right now to help protect the Great Barrier Reef, and approaches that can increase the reflectivity over the clear sky areas of the ocean. That might be by injecting nanobubbles in the upper layer of the ocean. It might be by inserting some sunlight reflecting aerosols into the atmosphere above. So that's sort of perhaps replacing the sulfate aerosol effect we have. There are also a number of approaches that appear to be capable of counterbalancing warming on local to regional basis. These include reflective films, mirrors, light-colored paint, other ways to increase the surface albedo, brightening clouds locally again, and revegetation of some regions which might increase evaporative cooling and possibly increase cloud cover. In putting together a credible plan, it is really important to recognize that none of the three major approaches, neither mitigation nor carbon removal nor climate intervention, or alternatively neither reduce, restore, nor reflect, can adequately keep global warming below 2 degrees C on their own. And no one of the approaches can take global warming back to less than 1 C on a sustained basis. We really have to have a comprehensive three-pronged effort to do that. In the talk just before mine, Pascal Lamy, chair of the Climate Overshoot Commission, proposed an approach for getting the reflection component of the effort started as a complement to other efforts. He suggested beginning with a coalition of vulnerable nations and peoples, especially those in low and very high latitudes that are facing extreme warming that is disrupting their communities and their health in some cases. As a first step, the structure needs to set up a scientific and energy expert analysis of possibilities, and for representatives of the impacted nations and peoples to generate, review, and present a plan for taking truly effective mix of actions in the 2030s. As this is going on, the developed nations, which can pay attention to that, but the developed nations in mid-latitudes need to focus their efforts on shifting their massive CO2 emitting energy systems to low-cost renewables, proving that it can be done. The outcome of this is just essential for ensuring over the long term a livable Earth for all future generations. So the future is ours to determine. If the community of nations does not become more active than pursuing all available approaches, the narrowing opportunities that we do have may be lost. So the question that a number of us have been asking, if not the three-pronged effort now, then when? And if not now, why not? As otherwise, Earth's climatic history, theoretical analyses and models, and the inadequate pace of present trends in cutting emissions suggest that catastrophic consequences lie ahead without it. It really is time to get acting. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike, for your very important insights. I think that was incredibly effective. It's so important for us to understand the strategies that are going to be most effective in a new climate plan and the importance of a holistic approach based on the climate triad. It seems like the integration of reflective strategies also helps support these vital nature-based drawdown solutions that are such a critical part of this holistic approach. Now, again, I welcome everyone to share your suggestions and ideas in the chat box. If you have questions for the speakers, please use the Q&A button. This is a place for like-minded people to find allies along the way to building a better pathway to a healthier planet. Now, our last speaker today is Robert Tulip of the Healthy Planet Action Coalition. Robert has been studying the need for a global agreement to focus on increasing planetary albedo. Take it away, Robert.
Planetary, the best time was 20 years ago. The next best time is today. The same applies to the need to restore our planetary sunlight reflection. We should have begun to slow the darkening of the Earth many years ago. Hello, my name is Robert Tulip. I'm a member of the steering circle of the Healthy Planet Action Coalition and chair of the World Student Christian Federation for the Asia Pacific region. Thank you, Dennis Garrity, and thanks to all who have brought this vital forum together to prevent 2 degrees of warming. It's an honour to be part of this discussion. Pascal Lamy has made the vital case for a first mover coalition led by the most climate vulnerable states. Mike McCracken has set out the essential triad for a climate plan: reduce emissions, remove greenhouse gases, and reflect sunlight. I will explain the urgent need to establish an albedo accord as the most immediate practical way to cool the Earth. Albedo is the measure of sunlight reflection from Earth to space. Satellite measurement shows albedo has fallen by 2% this century due to loss of clouds, ice, snow, and aerosols, what we can call the Earth's albedo layer. The Earth is getting physically darker and trapping more heat in a primary accelerating warming feedback process. The distinguished climate scientist, Dr. James Hansen, calculated that darkening since 2015 has caused about 4 times more warming than new emissions. Warming from the darkening of the Earth is swamping any possible cooling effect from emission reduction. We need to gain international agreement to restore the albedo layer as a vital contribution to planetary security and stability. The abrupt decline of albedo is a major emerging planetary security crisis, driving extreme weather, sea level rise, biodiversity loss, and systemic disruptions. An albedo accord is needed to enable urgent coordinated international action to stabilise and restore planetary reflectivity. Alongside the Paris Accord on emissions, an albedo accord can form a twin pillar of climate security, fundamental to political, economic, and military security and stability. A strategic pivot to deploy sunlight reflection technologies is needed to mitigate the catastrophic risks of warming. The precautionary principle demands action to protect and enhance albedo, to forestall warming processes that have catastrophic potential. By slowing the speed of warming, the albedo accord will provide vital time for societies, ecosystems, and species to adapt, directly addressing the collapse in biodiversity and protecting the ecological foundations of human well-being and of all life on Earth, as well as the foundations of our world economy. The albedo accord can govern and deliver measurable and acceptable interventions to restore planetary reflectivity without overburdening the political process. Key themes include shared responsibility, effective cooling, and global thinking. Sunlight reflection is essential planetary infrastructure. Restoring albedo recognizes our living planet as a single interconnected system and promotes peaceful cooperation to sustain Earth systems. Albedo shields us from harmful heat, with major benefits for the stability and health of our planetary environment, our economy, and our societies. These benefits justify the required investment in large-scale research and deployment. Greenhouse gas removal is essential, but too small, slow, and difficult, and expensive to be a primary strategy to cool the planet in this decade. Sunlight reflection is the only climate lever that can act rapidly to slow extreme weather, biodiversity loss, and tipping points. An albedo accord is the only way to prevent the planet reaching 2 degrees of warming, so we can step back from the dangerous hothouse precipice. The climate risks of not proceeding far outweigh any technology risks. There is extensive good research on the governance of solar geoengineering, but what is missing is an organised commitment and strategy for rapid deployment. I argued in an article published in the Hill newspaper this year that slowing global warming requires an albedo accord modelled on the Montreal Protocol. Just as the Montreal Protocol has a narrow technical focus to govern the removal of ozone-depleting substances, an albedo accord offers a focused mechanism to rebrighten and cool the planet. We need to repair the albedo layer, the clouds, ice, snow, and aerosols, just as the Montreal Protocol has repaired the ozone layer. The technical focus must also engage social, geopolitical, and ethical concerns. We need climate results that are fast, safe, scientific, cheap, popular, effective, reliable, and equitable. An albedo accord can cool the Earth with a small fraction of the funds the world now spends on climate response and recovery, or on ineffectual climate strategies focused on energy reform. Planetary cooling will be an industry for the 21st century on the scale of aviation and pharmaceuticals in the 20th century. A key challenge is to get support from industries who stand to benefit from the more benign and predictable climate created by higher albedo, such as insurance, banking, shipping, agriculture, tourism, defence, energy, and others. An industrial lobby can support governments to create a first mover caucus, targeting countries most vulnerable to warming impacts, and engaging civil society, especially religious organisations, as vital dialogue partners. Scientific communities in carbon dioxide removal and solar geoengineering should have a major role to support advocacy, program design, and evaluation of proposals. Possible initial funding sources include philanthropic capital and the reinsurance industry. The next climate conference of the parties should approve an albedo accord. Key first tasks to establish an albedo accord include defining structure and objectives, explaining the benefits of sunlight reflection, lobbying for funding, and building a coalition of interested nations and stakeholders. The new organisation should coordinate scientific research and development to model and test proposed methods, leading to management of safe and effective deployment. It will need robust systems for monitoring, review and verification, and transparent and accountable international governance in coordination with the valuable climate work others are doing on greenhouse gases. A technology-neutral approach can support cooling methods with the best safety, acceptance, and efficacy, evaluated on criteria such as cost, speed, scalability, risk, and measurable cooling benefit. The Albedo Accord will enable climate policy to shift from a carbon alone to an integrated approach to radiative forcing as the driver of warming. It will ensure climate measures are evaluated on cooling return on investment, recognising that albedo is a far more tractable and affordable climate lever than carbon removal, which cannot cool a darkening planet. The evaporation of marine clouds is a largely unrecognised source of heating that cannot be slowed by decarbonising our economies. The worst moral hazard is to allow preventable heat to amplify human and ecological harm because we're too slow to test the methods that could prevent it. An albedo accord can enable well-governed and effective cooling action based on evidence, consent, and accountability. We need a brighter planet, physically, emotionally, and culturally, to provide hope for a stable and prosperous future together. The Montreal Protocol worked because it was tightly scoped, rooted in science, and aligned with industry capability and public interest. An albedo accord can be similarly tight in scope and strong on science and equity from the start. Partnership on an albedo accord between affected industries, vulnerable states, funding bodies, civil societies, and the scientific community can define practical strategies to slow and reverse dangerous warming as fast as possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. It's so important for our planet to have a healthy albedo to support a healthy climate. It's a vital part of our holistic strategy. And, I really like the albedo approach as being able to raise awareness and focus on that vital element. And let me go ahead and turn it back to Dennis to direct our second Q&A session to address audience questions on the issues raised by our recent three speakers.
Okay, Aria, thank you. We're getting a little behind time, but we do have one question that has come in from Dr. August Temu that I think is very appropriate for Robert and his comments on the albedo accord. August is asking, given the multiple approaches we have heard with regards to lowering the temperature, is there a need for us to globally form groups of thinkers to advance each of these and, in fact, produce greater competition in climate change mitigation? So we're talking about the thinkers, the scientists, the technical people that can support a global agreement like the albedo accord. So Robert, would you want to take a shot at that?
Sure. Okay, I would say, Dennis, that I don't see the primary constraint as being within the scientific community. I think that what's most important first is to engage with the private sector with industries who stand to lose significantly from global warming. And the problem that we face is that with the polarization of our society, those industries have not really been mobilized to engage on the problem of the darkening of the world. And if the loss of albedo is going to potentially swamp anything that we do about carbon, then we need to get that message across. And so, yes, scientists need to get that message across, but then it requires the money and the influence of the commercial sector to engage governments to recognize albedo as a lever that is more tractable than carbon. I think Bruce Parker's comments about the speed of cooling that's available illustrated that we really need to have that sort of policy pivot to recognize rebrightening the earth as the top priority, and while recognizing that over the longer term that fixing the carbon problem is equally essential.
Very good, Robert. Yes, I agree. Given that we are running out of time, there are one or two other questions we'll have to pass over at the moment. So I'd like to give the gavel back to Arya, and we'll begin to wrap up our program today.
Okay, thank you, Dennis. I'll just say, it's really been an honor to be a part of this really important discussion. I think it's so important that we keep open minds about where we're at so that we can really let in this new level of understanding about where things are heading and how we can create a new strategy to move this forward. If anyone here would like to keep in touch with me, please go ahead and reach out at savingplanetus.org. And also, I participate in the Healthy Planet Action Coalition discussions. And we really welcome everybody here on this call to join us. We have really robust conversations. And I think Dennis can dig into that more. And I'm going to go ahead and just hand it back to Dennis.
Okay, very good. Well, thanks, Arya. We're now drawing to the end of our forum, and I do want to thank all of our speakers and panelists for sharing their valuable time and insights with us. If we were to try to summarize the way ahead from the presentations we've had today, I think that it's important for us to consider how we can actually motivate governments, perhaps a small number of governments of climate vulnerable countries, to come together and champion a new climate plan, what could be called a first mover coalition. Second, as Mike emphasized, we need a new comprehensive global plan that integrates all three of the tools in our toolbox: reduce, remove, and reflect. And the albedo accord that Robert has proposed is a very interesting way of focusing attention specifically on the agreements needed to improve the reflectivity of the Earth and to move us toward an agreement that could be as effective as the Montreal Protocol. We also must accelerate research and development on all of these solutions to carry forward, and we must intensify the conversations and dialogues across the globe. And so I think that as we draw this to a close and we look at where we go from here, we certainly want to develop a means of keeping in touch with you and to encourage you to contact us at the Healthy Planet Action Coalition to engage with us, perhaps join us as a member of this growing body of scientists and policy influencers and general public that is engaged in moving forward on these topics. Thanks again to our conference team, Anna Anantsova from our friends at the CDR 30 virtual pavilion for inviting us to convene this meeting, and to Althea, who has been our technical support and done a wonderful job for us today. Althea, thank you so much. And we now look forward to continuing our work to move forward in the development of solutions that will stick and will be effective in the future. So, as I mentioned at the beginning, we are on a journey that we're pursuing together, and a journey that will carry us forward to understanding, first of all, what needs to be done, and then mobilizing to enable the power to get it done in the future. We welcome your partnership and engagement as we move forward to build a safer climate for all, particularly our children and grandchildren. And with this, I hope that we can succeed. And I close this Global Heating Emergency special event and welcome our future efforts to make this happen together. Thank you all.